Welcome back to Space Iceland, one of our live stream events that's going on. I hope you've been able to join us earlier in the day or later on today, or indeed at any time, because it's virtual. Now, this panel is particularly interesting. It's about space activities in Iceland. And we're talking about the opportunities and the challenges and the next steps for space in Iceland. So we have a really cracking panel here. Let me introduce you. We have Alan Thompson, who's the head of government affairs from Skyrora. Alan's traveled from Scotland to be with us. We have Thor Fanndal, who's the director of Space Iceland. We have Björn Erlingsson, who's the research scientist in physical oceanography. And we have Helgi Gunnarsson, former MP. He's responsible for the 2016 Parliament resolution on Iceland joining ESA, the European Space Agency, and now he is the chair of Space Iceland's advisory board on ESA Iceland relationships. So we have some tremendous expertise here, and it's going to be very interesting hearing their thoughts. But I want to kick off with a question. I'm going to throw this to you, Alan, first, because you have a lot of interesting insight into policy. You've been dealing with this. You've been dealing with policy and permit and legal needs for suborbital launches. So you have a lot of expertise in that. Skyrora's head offices are in Edinburgh and Scotland, and the company has a presence in Iceland, where you've already launched once. So can you give us a sort of overview on what the similarities and differences between Iceland and the UK are in this area?
Thank you very much, Tira. Quite a broad-ranging question that I could probably answer in a couple of days, but I will try to limit myself to a couple of minutes here. Yes, the reason Skyrora is interested in Iceland and the reason why we're here right now is we are looking to sort of join the dots to establish the opportunity for us to launch our suborbital vehicle. This is to be an R&D launch, research and development launch, and we have come up with a whole load of reasons why we think that this opportunity here in Iceland is appropriate to pursue right now. In terms of the similarities of where we are between Iceland and the UK, and the point of view of developing this activity and enabling launch, yes, we sorry, it's not working. There we go. I hope that's now functioning okay. But yeah, the similarity between Iceland and the UK, so we as a company, Skyrora, was set up in the UK to look to take advantage of the opportunity of launching small satellites into space from the UK. We see in the UK a useful small satellite market that's been around for at least 25 years, and we see the opportunity that helping these satellites get access to low Earth orbit, which in the first instance will allow us as a society to get more Earth observation data. So 80% of those small satellites are all about looking down at Earth and trying to provide new measurements about how we can better manage our environment. So we as a company thought, well, yep, there's a logistics service provision there that's in requirement. There's an opportunity because today most of those small satellites are being launched from mostly the US, from our colleagues in the United States. SpaceX and other companies such as that. And we thought that there would be an opportunity to start launching from the north of Scotland over the polar ice caps on what's known as sun-synchronous orbits. So that was the original opportunity. We started our activity 4 years ago, and we set ourselves on trying to provide a logistics service provision for that activity and develop a small launch vehicle designed to launch those small satellites into those trajectories. We started specifically our activity with trying to demonstrate what launch meant to the UK in the first instance, to the people around and about us, by starting with what you could say is glorified fireworks. So just small rockets that you stick in a field and demonstrate how to launch. We came up with what we're calling a suite of small vehicles. So I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So four R&D vehicles that we wanted to launch as a company to demonstrate, again, the idea of progressing from a 1.5 meter vehicle to a 4 meter vehicle to a 6 meter vehicle to an 11.5 meter vehicle, and then all the way up to our go-to-market solution, transport solution, whatever you want to call it, which will be a 23 meter vehicle. And so we set about this idea of iterations of small launch. As I said, we started by launching back in, I think it was 18, was the first summer that we launched a 1.5 meter vehicle. We demonstrated the safety procedures, we just demonstrated our approach to making this happen. Just for note, if you're launching a small vehicle to an altitude of approximately 5 kilometers, there is no regulation. There are requirements around notice to airmen and temporary danger areas that you have to achieve, but effectively, so there are procedures that one has to go through to make that happen and engage with the regulators. In the first instance, that was to be the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, who have jurisdiction to 45 kilometres, and then the National Air Traffic Transportation System, or NATS in the UK, which basically manages air flight. So you had to engage with them to make it happen. Above that, again, while technically when we started activity there was no specific legislation for rocket launch, other than within the Civil Aviation Authority there was in there what's known as their Air Navigation Order, which is the basis of their jurisdiction. There was an article about rocket launch, but as I said, they're broadly, they didn't have much experience about this, they don't know how it worked, and on the whole, people who did any rocket launch in the UK over the last 20 years were regarded as amateur rocket launchers. They did it at the weekend, there was no commercial basis for this, etc. So we as a company wanted to start with and try to say, well, we want to understand what this means on a commercial basis. We made an application to the Civil Aviation Authority for our second vehicle, which is a 2-stage, 4-meter long vehicle going to an altitude of approximately between, well, 25 to 30 kilometers. And that application started in 2019. In the meantime, the regulator in the UK had taken a view that in order to allow this activity going forward, they needed to come up with the regulations before the activity was going to be allowed. So the application that we started, we'd hoped was going to form the basis of helping the regulator to inform its activity. However, it took rather a long time, 23 months. In the course of those 23 months, we started looking around for immediate other jurisdictions that could be more sympathetic or more proactive or more engaging around this concept, and immediate jurisdictions around the UK, both particular from the point of view of actually space launch and space in general. Access to space is something that we believe is a right, a human right to every human on the planet. So, trying to determine that the jurisdictions have their own approaches to that's fine, but actually we believe that what we're doing is enabling access to space, and that yes, there is a national aspect to it, but we were interested in trying to achieve it from this particular location in the Northern Hemisphere. And just as a note, one of the points that we had already sight of or foresight of in our launch activity, our planned launch activity for the United Kingdom from the north of Scotland, was the fact that some of the trajectories that we were looking at would inevitably mean that we needed to engage with the Icelandic authorities around their territorial interests, the exclusive economic zone around Iceland, and the potential for Skyrora splashing down in that aquatoria in the marine environment around Iceland. So in any case, we were interested in developing a relationship with the government of Iceland, with the authorities, to begin to start talking about this activity. We then were introduced through a number of, I suppose, happenstances, really useful people around our network suggesting, and we started with a contact with the Icelandic authorities in London, and then we were introduced to Space Iceland, and we discovered that there was already a base of enthusiasm around this in Iceland. And basically from then, I suppose you could say almost the rest is history. We pushed forward, we developed a really useful relationship with Space Iceland, and we started planning this activity at the beginning of, I think it was actually 19, wasn't it? But I know we had a couple of physical trips here at the beginning of 20, and we ended up with, I'm very proud to say, a very successful suborbital launch of our micro in the summer of last year. it was a very big learning for us as an organization, again, because we were looking at R&D activity, and this activity exclusively was to demonstrate, to capture all the data around it, to demonstrate how we would do it as a company, and to use that as the example of how we're planning to do the next one up, so scaling our activity upwards. That was a really useful experience. In terms of the regulatory aspects, again, I think because again we were doing this for the first time, and indeed the Icelandic authorities were sort of entertaining this concept for the first time, we were very fortunate in having the opportunity to engage with the authorities directly and to demonstrate, or at least on paper, this activity and how we were planning to manage the risks involved in this activity, and take advantage of Icelandic's wonderful geography and the fact that there aren't that many people around, so reducing the risks to human life are relatively easy when you're talking about the remote locations that Iceland has to offer. So we, I think, went through a very useful, let's say, non-objection procedure with the Icelandic authorities, introducing them to this concept, and having achieved a non-objection from all the relevant parties, including the search and rescue, the environment authorities, and the transport authorities. We were confident that we could undertake this activity in August of last year. So, yeah, I believe that, and I do hope and know that Space Iceland has done a great job in also introducing this activity as a development step in space in general in Iceland, and how that's progressing. And now we're here very much trying to do the same thing, but on a bit of a larger scale for, as I said, an 11-meter rocket, which is going to go to approximately 120 kilometers. This again is an R&D for us. This is the penultimate stage before we go to what we're calling a regular market solution, a go-to-market vehicle. And yeah, so I'm here at the moment, apart from taking part in this wonderful festival, I'm also here at the moment to try and understand what we as a company should be doing to engage with the correct authorities, to get the authorities not just through a process of non-objection, but actually into a more sustainable, let's say, concept around issuing a permit to make this activity happen. And again, we're doing it not just for ourselves, we're doing it for the advancement of the access to space for Iceland, and indeed for trying to demonstrate what that means in a practical way. Because we believe that, as I said, at the beginning of this very long 20 minutes, that access to orbit and access to low Earth orbits in the first instance enhance the life of the people on the surface by allowing us to measure better the environment in which we're in and give us better solutions about how we can best mitigate the challenges that we're encountering due to weather or to atmospheric, or to how we are actually, the impact we're having on the environment as individuals. So we do believe that the activity we're engaging is actually improving our understanding both of our immediate environment but also of our space environment. And these are the kind of the higher goals that we have in mind, and we're trying to do it in an environmentally friendly and sensible and responsible way as possible. So, sorry, rather a long answer, but thank you for the question.
Thank you, Alan. And you have taken us on a journey there through, because the opportunities that you mention and the challenges that you've gone through. So it gives us an excellent overview. You talked about the fact that that launches are both in the national interest for the UK, and also the national interest of Iceland, if they're from Iceland, and the international dimension that comes from being part of the space world. And so, which leads me on to to throw a question to you, Helgi, because you were behind the resolution in 2016 on Iceland's membership of ESA. Now, ESA, European Space Agency, is going through a very interesting time at the moment, and there's a lot of new development there. We're going to be talking about a little bit of it here and some later on. But as a politician responsible for this, can you give us some background of what was it that got you interested in space and involvement in and the fact that you believe that ESA will reinforce the ability to move forward in space? Why isn't Iceland yet a member? Can you? I will throw that at you.
So I got interested in this for a somewhat romantic reason. I learned that The first thing that an Icelander needs to do to become an astronaut is to become something else than an Icelander as well. That is to say, achieve citizenship in a country that has an active space program. And I thought this was sort of sad, you know, that can't tell our children that they could become astronauts. Now, that was sort of the spark, but then once you start looking into this, you realize that this is not just romanticism, although I think that's totally warranted personally. But the opportunities involved in membership and international cooperation on space gives small institutions like Iceland the opportunity to partake in something that we typically only think of in terms of giant nation states, the likes of the United States or Russia or China or Japan, like seriously industrialized massive nations that have these space programs. So once you start realizing how space is developing into this cooperative framework, especially in Europe, which is a conglomerate of different nations of different sizes and such, you realize that there is no good reason for us not to be in space. I mean, we are a part of the United Nations. It's an independent country with a thriving scientific sector and a very experienced software sector. We have all sorts of scientists, all sorts of people working in all sorts of industries. So why are we not there, as you accurately asked? And there simply is no good reason for us not to be there. The reason I think that we're not there yet, though, is kind of psychological, in my opinion. When I first started talking about this in Parliament, people seemed to get the impression that I was suggesting that we build a giant rocket, we fill it up with money, and we shoot it into the sun. And so I had to sort of, and retrospectively this was silly, but I had to sort of say, I'm not talking about shooting from Iceland, that would be crazy. This I used to say back in 2014 and 15 to sort of calm people down, you know, no, I'm not completely insane, hear me out here, this is good stuff. Then of course, happily I was wrong, we totally can shoot things from Iceland, why not, right? And that's sort of the journey that I see from this whole membership application business, is that you keep running into new venues for things that you previously couldn't imagine. And that is, of course, the ultimate romanticism with space exploration. It's precisely that, running into things that you didn't know were there, and you didn't know you were looking for it even. And I think that it's natural for a very small country like Iceland to immediately rule itself out due to size, because we're used to thinking of space in terms of the Cold War, essentially, you know, the moon landings and all that. But I think that's changing very slowly, somewhat painfully, but I think it is changing, because when I speak to my friends in politics, all of them get excited about this once they hear about it. Once they sit down and really think about this, they all get excited. They all think it's interesting. They all see the opportunities. And there's basically not a scientific field out there that is irrelevant to space, right? Like basically anything we do here in Iceland in terms of science and industry has some relevance, to varying degrees, but some relevance. Now this presents another problem, which is a bit ironic, is that the authorities in Iceland, they don't really know where to place this thing. So it started off going to the Foreign Ministry. They had no idea what to do with it, so they gave it to the Ministry of Education, which also was somewhat confused about. They saw lots of opportunities. That was not the issue. They were very excited about it, actually. It's just, where do you put this? Iceland, space? I mean, come on, right? All right. This is the psychology that I think is hindering or slowing us down, rather. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that sooner or later, this mindset will change. And once it does, I am confident that things will speed up very quickly, because there's a few good things about very small countries like Iceland. One of them is that things happen fast. Yes. Everyone does everything at the same time. It's just like there's an idea, and once it catches on, it's wildfire immediately. And so I'm pretty confident that's going to happen. I wish it was already there, but
now I know Thor wants to he has something to add here, but before I let you go take that over, Thor, I just wanted to say. Point out that one thing that perhaps people in Iceland have don't appreciate is the fact that not only you are closer to space in many ways, and that you are dealing much more with the surface of the Earth than just about any other nation on the planet, and also the fact that Iceland looks after its volcanoes. I mean, just the seismology and the prediction involved with your volcanoes. I think, quite frankly, if you can deal with volcanoes, space is not that much more difficult. And with that observation, Thor, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on, because Helgi mentioned something that we've talked about a couple of times. The idea of servicing the launch industry in Iceland. And I remember when we were in 2018, when Space Iceland was announced, and we had a couple of meetings, strategic meetings, like what are the low-hanging fruits, what activity do we have here, and how can we expand that activity? And there were a couple of crazy people who were like, launch, it's an obvious one. And I am, yeah, it's silly to say now, but I was like, yes, but we aren't quite there yet, so let's re-examine it in 5 years. So it wasn't actually, it is now part of the Space Iceland strategy, very much, but it wasn't for a few months. What then obviously happened is that we are absolutely flooded with interest in launching. There is, we tend to emphasize projects that create, like I said earlier this morning, policy vehicles, so technical projects or scientific projects, R&D, that also allow us to engage with the government. So that's been it's been a very welcomed addition to our strategy, and to everyone that at those meetings that I said, no, let's keep it real here. I can apologize. But you were talking about the psychological reasons for why Iceland hasn't joined ESA, and why it can sometimes be a little bit confusing and sort of scattered when we talk about space with the authorities in Iceland. And I do think that this is, like, you are actually right about this. Because I remember 2019, our first year, that I had to fake laugh at every single meeting when we were introduced, me and my colleague Alpha, which wasn't able to be here, we were introduced as the people wanting to send Icelanders to the moon. And it was only funny, well, it was never funny, it was funny maybe twice, and then we kind of pretended to laugh. And so, and I know it doesn't sound like much, but I want to actually say that in 2020, this joke just disappeared. And now we are the people trying to emphasize the benefit for traditional sectors of Iceland's participation in space, which was always, I think, where I came from. I mean, it just seems so obvious that the opportunities for skill share, tech transfer, and the space sector's impact on traditional sectors like fishery, agriculture, transport, safety, telecommunication, that's it's so obvious from where we're sitting, but maybe maybe a little harder to explain as a context, because rockets, rovers, satellites, and astronaut training is very picturesque. It's just lovely being around these things, and they are interesting. They are more interesting than the pits. Well, we could have a thriving business here with 20, 30, 100 people where they are analyzing data and feeding it to governmental databases. But that's where the economic activity in Iceland is at this moment, and we have huge opportunities there. So I just want to kind of agree with you, Helgi.
Well, I'd like to also throw a question to you, Björn. What do you think? You are a research scientist in oceanography, And so what can you tell us? What do you think is the most relevant opportunity for space sciences? And I apologize. As for space sciences and the application of Earth observation that Alan was pointing out that Skyroar is very much involved in. What is the relevance of Earth observation for Icelandic society, and what new opportunities do you see on the horizon?
Well, this is always a question in Iceland. What is the use for it? How will it bring food on the table for us? And in general sense, there are opportunities for technology, engagement, and work all the way, as we call upstream, where the instruments are, the launching, and all the way to the end user. What defines Iceland and Icelandic society and history is it's to living in extreme conditions with relation to nature, and not just in the oceans. We have the glaciers, we have the eruptions, and it's all here. And actually, that is every moment since Earth observation started to come along, we got something new to see, something more that helped and increased the resilience of the society, and better weather forecast, better understanding, prediction. Now we are following the volcanoes and the chambers, and in a way, the new era. As I see, there are two segments that I see as on the horizon with space industry. From my perspective, is the end user applications, use of Earth observation data from satellites combined with model data and in situ measurements. There's a huge potential for value added in data processing and in that. It's extremely rich, so to say, and it's not just about the climate and the temperature outside. It's much more profound insights into the climate system. We live here facing the Arctic and the oceans. We live on the edge between those, so we have to look beyond our Icelandic waters. We have to look into the Arctic and around. And so that is one. The second one is that there's an extremely nice and good test bench for all kinds of activities, as has been mentioned here. But there is an initiative for ESA for icy moons, and we have glaciers and we have glaciers and test beds for all kinds of studies that have to go deep into space as well. So there's a whole spectrum. Actually, not a line; it's a circle, so to say, upstream, downstream. So with the technology and the use of the technology, and give a feedback from the use up to the upstream technical development. So Iceland is a very special place for that.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Tira has had to leave us. So I want to follow up on that. So Space Iceland has been working with Björn for some time, and I apologize, Björn, if you're tired of me talking about this, but I am absolutely fascinated. So in the 80s, Björn wrote a theoretical paper about usage for available satellite or Earth observation data, but his ideas were, at the time, we didn't really have the computing power, and I don't mean Iceland. We just generally, as humankind, really didn't have or access to the computing power wasn't that great. So that's become quite relevant recently, and this old paper is being cited a bit more. And or Björn, I shouldn't say we, because we just kind of tag along. Björn has been trying to kind of re-engage with that. Can you explain? Can you talk a little bit about it without giving too much away? But also, what it kind of brings to light is also why access to space has, the cost of access to space has reduced so significantly. I mean, we've just computing power, manufacturing processes, and efficiency is just at a level that we don't fully understand. We can't contextualize the change in the last 20 years when it comes to this. So I'm going to throw the mic back to you.
Yeah, this is from this, there was a satellite launched in 78, and it lived for 105 days. And it opened a new era in Earth observation, or RadarSats. And I remember it from the time when we got the data and looked at the data. We had, there was obvious, the system, the sea ice in the Arctic, that was the data about the sea ice in the Arctic. It was not, we are not describing it as it was observed. So in a way, we had to do something new, and not only new, it was so clear signals of processes in the data that had been hidden for us until then. This was in such a way you have to be able to explain it in the palms of your hands, and that started and triggered the theoretical development of a theory for interpretation of fracture patterns in the sea ice, and it also required innovation or a new set of concepts in those processes, and that were not part of the mainstream modeling of sea ice at that time. And I wrote this paper and came along with some qualitative and quantitative research for that. And I remember it as yesterday, looking at this data and seeing this is not as we think it is. That was, and now as this evolves and we have more data and more computing power, we are getting more and more use of this. So in the climate issues, what is happening in the Arctic when the ice breaks and opens and reaches up and has a huge impact on the Arctic amplification, the feedback of the climate change in the Arctic. So to say that we are with a huge possibilities in coming up sensors a couple of years in the future, and even now we have the processing and get more use of the data, and that is the next step, to have processing out in space, and this is a new era, and the information that we will get is always, and is very relevant for the climate issues today.
So Alan, I'm going to ask you something as well, because I think Sky Aurora is also a good example of this change. Like, you shouldn't really use the word cheap when it comes to space, because it isn't. But I mean, access to space, it's less expensive now than I think we ever could have dreamt that it could become, and we're going to see it evolving and continuing. And so the question is, I mean, is twofold. First of all, Sky Aurora, as my understanding is, exists because of this very real because of this, and also because of a very particular thing, that satellite development has gone through such rapid change that the service provider, the rocket or the orbital launches, suborbital and orbital launches providers have not really been able to catch up. There's a lack of rides. Bus tickets are not available, actually. And the other one is for the same reasons, you actually are looking at some very innovative way to not only get satellites in orbit, but also service them, and hopefully being able to contribute to cleanup and removal of space debris. So,
thank you. Yes, no. Indeed, as just described, there's this wonderful continuum where you start measuring, you begin to understand a bit more about what it means. And as was also shared a bit earlier on, you start discovering things that you never knew were possible, or in places that you never knew were possible. And it's this wonderful journey that we're on. Skyrora, as you mentioned, Thor, in terms of the optimization or whatever it is, making it lower cost or more accessible, let's put it that way. The opportunity that we have right now, and what you're referring to in terms of the demand. So the satellite companies in the UK, they are inspired by to get smaller, more efficient, and there's this kind of natural evolution of the industry there through saturation into more efficient solution provision, and what else can they be doing with satellites. The fundamental flaw of where they are at the moment is the fact that apparently from the completion of a construction of a satellite until it finally gets anywhere near a launch pad, it takes about 2 years now. As you said, Thor, there aren't that many tickets on the bus service these days, although the bus service is getting more frequent and larger. Nevertheless, there's still quite a heavy backlog. And yes, that's one of the aspects that Skyrora is looking to address. It's not just the fact that there's a backlog, but also the fact that we believe that by providing more regular access to space from our specific geography, that will then represent an uplift in the design of satellites and, again, the next, let's say, generational development around satellites and what they can do for us, and indeed what being up there means. So as was described here, we're still getting to grips with some of the aspects around our immediate environment, with the oceans, with the icebergs, etc., and the breakup of ice. And we're already beginning to look further beyond that into space and the environment up there. And some of the challenges that we think we're beginning to touch the tip of the iceberg on, good joke, beginning to look at are very much led from our experience here on Earth. One of the things about the why launch is becoming easier and cheaper, you could say, is the single most impactful advancement in terms of making that happen is this concept of 3D printing. 3D printing is the revolution that has been designed for, that is feeding into and making engine printing possible. If you think about it, the access to space up until the occurrence of the 3D printer was incredibly expensive because of the number of hours, of man-hours, of individual hours spent on designing an engine and then actually putting the engine together. So that, you're thinking this big thing that has a huge number of tons of thrust, to be able to launch a large vehicle into, we're only talking starting from 500 kilometers up there, but again, that's against the weight of gravity, and then going further once you get there. And the idea that the single most expensive part of the vehicle obviously was always the engine. Why is that? Basically, as I said, it's the number of hours invested into designing the engine so that the engine wouldn't explode or wouldn't overheat, or, the very complex things. And the advancement of 3D printing meant that the cooling channels that any engine has around it could be replaced from the copper tubing, which was the most expensive part of this. The copper, the almost like wires around the engine, which were which were enabling the cooling of the structure of the combustion chamber, to be replaced now with basically those same channels in the integral structure of the engine itself. So 3D printing, you can actually, rather than individually casting and post-machining those individual copper tubes, they're now being printed into the integral part of the chassis of the engine. Huge amount of time savings in terms of physical effort from the individual, and a huge amount of cost, obviously, because we're replacing the need to have those individual pipes made by hand. And so, yes, the advancement of 3D printing, as we're seeing, significant reduction of the cost of the engine, and therefore the significant reduction of the cost of the propulsion system to be able to allow to start transporting things into space on a more regular basis. Yes, there are other companies around, particularly in the US, who are looking to take it further and actually print entire rockets. We think at the moment the technology probably hasn't quite been tested sufficiently enough on the containing of pressurized gases, well, the hydrogen peroxide that we're utilizing, or the liquid oxygen that's used in most traditional launches, together with the kerosene. However, we do admire their aspirations and obviously trying to take inspiration from them going forward. But yeah, so we're beginning to develop solutions for ourselves in our own need to go through R&D and then go into assembly that are very practical and very cost sensitive, let's put it that way. And yes, the next step of us being able to demonstrate what these cost sensitive issues are and where society's position is in that, what we're doing in terms of societal change, we're allowing disruptive individuals with innovative ideas to come along and actually enhance pragmatic, cheap solutions that we can then incorporate to continue to make this assembly that we're doing as relevant to the market as possible. And then as you mentioned, it's not just focusing on the launch, we're also then beginning to understand what it is that we need to demonstrate to society. So if we're going to be responsible for the logistics service provision that we want to do for these small satellites, we need to then think about, how are we going to do it? What's the methods that we're using? What are the propulsion systems? How are we going to do it in an environmentally sensitive way? Obviously, if we're starting to do combustion engines, then of course there's going to be something burning, and inevitably there's going to be carbon in there at some point. So we can't coherently talk about a net zero solution from scratch, from starters. We need to advance towards the propulsion systems which are then going to be significantly more improved, so that we don't actually necessarily contribute to the carbon or the hydrocarbon issues in the environment, but actually start to try to reduce them. So yes, we as a company are trying to table some of these concepts, trying to understand them, and through better understanding of them, through better measurement, we are beginning to find similarities or ways of measuring them that are applicable to the activity and what we're ending up going to be doing by providing a presence in space. And yes, Skyrora, as part of its main go-to-market vehicle, has a third stage, which is a space tug. The space tug, like any other tug or remote operating vehicle or whatever else it is, we're trying to use to create a platform to provide a more sustainable service to either our immediate customers, the satellites in space, or indeed to start trying to address some of the challenges that they're faced with, that of space debris. What is up there already and how it is affecting our customers? How is it damaging their items, whatever else it is? So by us contributing to a platform to support their activity, either through refueling of their satellites or by maneuvering of their satellites or removing of those satellites, we're also incorporating the aspiration to remove other bits of space debris. And this is something that we believe as an organization, this is our responsibility for embarking upon that line of activity in the first place. We are desperately keen to reach out to societies to say, yes, we're doing this in this way, but actually we're looking to do it, as I said already, with very much in mind the environmental benefits that we're looking to drive to Earth, but also in trying to want to do space better, in trying to want to recreate not just the existing standards that we're applying to ourselves on Earth, but also begin to try and improve them in space to the extent of our ability. And that, I think, is the inspirational side of the journey that we're very much on, and very much, I mean, just as an example, even on the oceanographic side, there's an experiment that we're aware of, a continuing line of inquiry around the UK that is looking into capturing more data around wrecks on the bottom of the ocean and how they pollute the environment. Why are we aware of it is because we are looking to do a simulation about the splashdown of our vehicle, and the company doing the simulation is engaged in this area of scientific research. And it's this area of scientific research which has a direct parallel to capturing data about debris in space. It's exactly the same technologies that they're utilizing on the bottom of the ocean today that we need to be able to improve in identifying the behaviors. So it's not just the wreck on the bottom of the ocean that's not moving. What are the behaviors of that wreck? What are the behaviors of the satellite? Are they tumbling? What is it doing? How do we know, if we have a platform in space, how do we know it's easy just to go along and pick it up and remove it? It's not. It could be, apart from the velocity at which it's traveling, it could be, as I said, tumbling, it could be demonstrating behaviors that we don't know anything about. So it's trying to solve these questions for ourselves, given the technologies that we already have, and actually trying to do it with very much in mind, as I said, the environmental and the responsibility of any company doing it today in our existing environment and extending that to others. So that's the inspirational side of thing. That's the way we're headed as a company in terms of our development. And yes, we are looking to do it on the way to help solve, just the simple, straightforward access to space on a regular basis. Sorry.
Thank you. So let's go. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. Let's go and discuss Iceland and where we are. And Helgi, I'm going to ask you to start. And I want to ask you two things. I am going to assume, because we've spoken every now and then, that you've learned quite a lot since the resolution was put in place. But if you could tell us a little bit about the activity that you've seen and what has kind of surprised you, and also how the sector has, in your view, developed, especially when it comes to communicating with the authorities. Because I have noticed this as well, that you mentioned that when you talk to your colleagues, everyone gets excited. And I hope I don't offend anyone if I describe it like this. So in Iceland, you have two types of politicians when it comes to space. One that is yet not convinced and doesn't really see the opportunities, and then the other ones that have absolutely been convinced and see endless possibilities. And actually, when it comes to space, that becomes one of the issue. Like the applications are just so endless that it's a bit overwhelming. What we at Space Iceland are trying to do is to kind of maybe have more people understanding the possibilities, but also willing to make a choice. Like, we need to focus. And that has kind of happened. But where do you think we stand at the moment, and what have you noticed in recent years?
So, with regard to, so my primary sort of driving force is to get us into an international cooperative agreement in the space sector in order for us to fully engage with all the opportunities that we would have access to. As for, so where we stand right now is a bit complicated, like so many things. There's COVID, which took out about 2 years of a lot of people's time. And what I have been doing is trying to speak with, well, I've been speaking with fellow politicians abroad who share these problems of communicating the opportunities to politicians, having them act on specific things and sort of informing them of what to do and how to do it. The why part really isn't that big of a factor because, like you said, the moment you just have a 5-minute conversation with them about this, they tend to get it. I still haven't spoken with any politician in any party about matters of space with the result of the person thinking that we should not be members of ESA or that this is a waste of money and time. It just doesn't happen. That view is isolated among those who haven't given this any thought or attention so far. So that's a pretty clear qualifier when it comes to the opportunities that are obvious once you run into this. And so I guess what has surprised me the most to learn. So I was never surprised that we had full errand with that we have lots of opportunities in, say, software development, because that's an industry that you can have basically anywhere. There's no size requirement for an IT department. It can be just one human being, right? And then you have your programming shop or whatever. So that's an obvious low-hanging fruit, me coming from that industry. But once you think about Iceland and what science means in Iceland on Icelandic matters, like you said, the opportunities not only become obvious, they become overwhelming. Geology, weather, and resource management, agriculture and fishing in particular. These are obviously space-related. It's obvious that we need to use data, and we do use data from space in order to predict these things, map them, figure out how things are evolving, and what we can do about that evolution if it's taking the wrong turn. So I think for a while now, I think, and I'm not quite settled on which strategy is best, honestly, because things are going slowly on the political side, while they are moving sort of on their own accord on the industry side, where there are like Space Iceland and Skyrora and scientists and people in Iceland that are actually engaged in the space sector already without government interference or support. So I tend to wonder these days. I used to think that, you know, we need the government to sort of make this happen, but as Alan explained earlier, how do you make an industry by making a regulation? This is not how things work. You need the regulation to sort of keep it under control and within reasonable limits with regard to safety and environmental factors and such. So I sort of wonder whether the politicians need convincing so that they give a go-ahead, or if they just need to sort of wake up one day and realize, oh, there's a space sector in Iceland. What are we doing about that? Oh, right, we had this application. So I'm not sure if it's going to come from me as a former politician lobbying with other politicians. I certainly don't think it's going to hurt, so I'm going to keep doing it. But I think really that what's going to push the politicians in Iceland en route to full membership, or at least some kind of a cooperative agreement with the European Space Agency, is going to come from the industry and the scientific fields and people and companies and research institutes that just are doing something that the government isn't aware of and possibly doesn't care very much about, but have problems related to regulation, permits, and in many cases support. Now, I need to add one thing with regard especially to while I think that this industry could do amazing things. It is on its way to do amazing things even without membership of ESA. With membership of ESA, that enlarges the playing field to an extent that is difficult to describe. And it's
market access
and access to expertise, to education, to all sorts of influence, and of course just plain support. You know, you have business incubators and all sorts of programs that help people on the ground make companies, implement ideas, examine business cases, and all sorts of things. And so that's to me sort of now the importance of joining ESA is no longer for me necessarily personally to tell my kids that they could become astronauts later on. It's much rather, you already can be astronauts, you'll just have to do it through a private company instead of a nation-state-wide institution like ESA. But instead, it's that you have a whole bunch of opportunities to become either astronauts or scientists or what have you related to space. It just blows up the whole picture. So that's my driving force at the moment. I really want to stress, though, that I sort of keep 2 years. So if I think this was in 2016 when it was passed in Parliament. Parliament has decided to apply. That decision has been made already by the highest authority in the land. And that was 5 years ago now. And so it's happening slowly, but let's remember, first of all, these things do happen slowly, and arguably they should. Arguably they should happen slowly, or at the very least so that, you know, people don't, so that the opportunities at every step of the way are exercised fully and people know how to take the next step. Second, I would cut 2 years off of this because of COVID, honestly. And it's not because, I mean, people haven't been able to meet about this, it's just that COVID has taken over the focus of so many relevant parties that are needed to make this happen. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but truly, what makes me truly optimistic is seeing the industry flourish, even without government support so far.
Yeah, I'm going to be optimistic as well. I'm notoriously impatient, so but when you look back, you understand that we've done so much in the last few years. So I'm going to pass it to you, Alan, and maybe also add specific, which is the Iceland-UK MOU on space cooperation, which is still we're still kind of understanding what we're going to do, but it is important for both countries.
I wanted to comment on the last Rakos, whatever it was, just because I'd like to say that I think space is one of the most compelling economic development opportunities that any country can possibly have at this precise moment in time. Just because of the sheer magnitude, as we said already, space is all enveloping. It affects every single area of science. It affects everything, almost everything that we're doing on a daily basis. It's just we don't necessarily, we take it for granted, we don't really necessarily look into what it means for us. So I think, and indeed, from the point of view of a UK national and the UK government's approach to this, yes, I think one of the few individuals who really kick-started this process had this perception that space was a prism for the complete overhauling of the civil service. Why do I mean that? It's because in order for space to work, in order for us as a society, as a humankind, to access the next level up of sophistication, those dots need to be joined. It needs to work as a system. And if you have an inefficient civil service, if you have an inefficient system, it's not going to work. So the fundamental is that space and launch in the UK in particular, but for those countries that are looking at it, is a new qualitative level of an approach to economic development, and for us, almost like as a more enlightened society. We're getting to a different level of enlightenment. And I truly believe that is the opportunity. Yes, within the specific area of launch vehicle manufacture, we're talking about manufacturing, so space, physical manufacturing, the engineering capabilities that you require, but the inspiration and the disruptive desire that you can actually harness and allow us to take us further. What about spacecraft? What about, fission engines? What about, renewable sources of power when you get up there? What about mining minerals from rock, using microbes? How are we going to use the building blocks once we get to space? What's the next level? Again, at one very simple level for Skyrora, we have developed our own 3D printer. You can stick it on our space tug and lo and behold, we've got 3D printing in space. Wow, that's really, are we ready for this? I don't think so. But yeah, I would agree you need to approach it cautiously. I would agree you need to take it, step by step in a sensible way. But I would say at the same time, it's through that connectivity, joining those dots, making it happen, that this will speed up. And I think, yes, I think there is this understanding that, we don't really understand what the total implications of this decision about that non-object that we got last year or the permit that we're trying to approach this year. We are doing our best as a company, as a society, to say, well, actually, this brings all of this into scope. So when you're making a decision about an environmental permit for us to allow to launch, you are thinking not just about tomorrow, but you're thinking about 5 years down the line. You are, and you should be thinking about, Icelandic astronauts. You should be thinking about access and how, and how this is going to enhance our understanding of the icebergs or our immediate environment. You should be thinking about what that means in space. Sorry
to interrupt you, but I just want to agree. Björn Tryggvason, our Icelandic astronaut, we need a new one. It's been a while. So I have to agree with that.
So yeah, no, and to come back to your second question, the MOU between the UK and Iceland, I think actually I'm excited because, as I said, from our point of view, we sought this need to have this dialogue. We think that, again, what we're doing is exciting, it's compelling, it's inspiring. We get inspired by our own engineering work, which sounds really kind of quirky, I suppose, or whatever you want to call it. But yes, building those blocks forward and sharing that journey, as I said, it's something that we can't deny to our children and to our children's children, that excitement. The challenge that we're faced with today is we have these astronauts who are inspiring individuals. How are they going to find their path, their career path from where they are today through to be that astronaut? You know, how can you make it easier for them? Or how can they discover, how can they actually be disruptive in their innovative ideas, in their creativity? How do you not fail them before they, on their route to understanding that path? How can we do the best we can possibly so that that inspiration that we have, obviously being in the wonderful place as Husavik, the aspiration and the die-hard attitude of we can do this and we do this really well and let's share this with the world. This is, it's this attitude that you need to fuel. It's this attitude that we as a society who are beginning to scratch the surface of getting access to space, this is what we're on about. And this MOU, from my point of view, although it sounds a bit kind of grey and, whatever else it is, a bit out of date, yes, there's an opportunity there to fill that with content, to fill that with vibrant examples of what we're doing today for tomorrow and actually how we can continue that. So as I mentioned already, the collaborations that support our launch, that support our understanding of launch, that support the next step, that support the dream of our children. This is what it needs to be. It sounds, again, I know MOU was probably born out of the need from the UK side to, well, actually, guys, we need to talk to the Icelandic. Oh, they're a bit harsh in their environmental standards. And yes, we remember the Cod Wars. Oh, do we? And how the hell are we going, UK launch is going to drop something in their exclusive economic zone? Well, let's see how we can do it in a practical way that we can actually fulfill the requirements and take into account that we've left the Cod Wars way behind. Let's look forward to the next opportunity of discussion and discourse. Let's look, let's demonstrate and understand it better in a collaborative way. And this for me is what that MOU is about. And so it's a big opportunity. And I think there is that excitement that we are beginning to understand more. And the more we can share that excitement, the more that will have a positive effect. So
yeah, and I mean we are just still kind of working out some of the details on how we want to implement it, but it is important, and I think it's worth noting that the Foreign Ministry did a fantastic job on getting this through. So Björn, because we're talking about where Iceland stands, there have been we've seen some good developments with now. Iceland, well, it's a bit iffy where we stand here, but like always, but Iceland seems to have joined the European Union's agency for a space program. Which is a consolidation of other programs that we were part of. But EGNOS is now going to be put in full effect in Iceland over the next few years, and this includes Copernicus and Galileo. So we have that, and Galileo is a program that Copernicus and Galileo is a program that we've always seen here in Iceland and the sector as one of the more accessible and important at the moment for where we are. And this is your field, so do you have any comments on where we are and what should be the next step?
Yes, well, we are at a very exciting moment in time, in my view. In a way, today, of course, Iceland is small, and it's very important to get access to those programs because they have instruments of developing infrastructure or incubation strategies and companies and grants, submission of science and technical development grants where the market cannot, when you have a very low technology readiness level, maybe blue sky ideas that have a great potential. So this infrastructure, but we need to do more homework. we need to. you could say it's a pure potential that we have. We have a lot of vehicles, and we have some big roads somewhere out there. But we need to connect the roads. We need to get between roads to take the right directions. And that is homework, in my opinion. And fuel on the tank for driving on the road. But the return is very rewarding. We don't need to, it's like, yeah, it will all come back. On what time scale? Will the money come back? Yes, for our economy. But the most important part is to participate in the infrastructure enhancement, better and stronger society. And that if we don't follow this and become part of this 21st century endeavor, we are doomed to be heading behind. We lose our competitiveness in people's skills, technology, infrastructure, and effective society, and we will have a worse society. We will not be able to tackle the challenge of climate change and all the industrial changes and societal changes that need to be done. So we can stop talk about the return, what we'll get back, and start what we have to find out. What can we do to get moving? Take small steps and move in and get the vehicle moving. And there are all lots of activities that can be started. Giving returns in kind, yes, money needs to be in place, but it's a development of an infrastructure, and getting the ERSA membership is a very, very important for a part of for Iceland as a society, because they have been developing this for 30, 40 years or what have you. So it's not, they are not they didn't start on this yesterday. So that is my...
All right, so I'm going to finish up. We've gone a little bit over time, but thank you for being here and willing to discuss this. Just a quick, if I may answer my own question. I mean, I can't say how happy I was when the statement came from the government, the ministry, that ESA was now going to, no, EGNOS was now going to be in full action and full coverage. It is, I mean, we are here in Húsavík, where they've been, where the domestic airliner has been using EGNOS at a capacity that isn't perfect as a test project. And we've always been faced with this, that it's not, we need to improve the availability of it a little bit. This is a safety issue I mean, it increases the safety of air passengers and flights domestically to an extent that I don't think we can fathom. So we're very glad to see this happen, and this has been something that we've been talking about since 2018. But I can't say that Space Iceland has been the only one, because this is something that most people that have insight into the risk of running domestic flights, in particular to smaller airports, understand. So that's a great thing, and I have to celebrate that. Some of the things that have been happening is there have been discussions, thankfully, which on Iceland joining the Artemis Accord. There's no word on that yet, but for me, I think that's a no-brainer. Mostly giving our legacy of actually participating in the Apollo program, the fact that we were a secondary airport for NASA in many times, and we contributed to geological training. And I think it's a no-brainer that Iceland should participate in geological training for the Artemis program. ESA, just because I want to emphasize this, market access, not being part of ESA does not mean that we haven't been able to cooperate and utilize some of the, I mean, we still have access to some of the papers published. We still can have a good relationship, and there is still a need to utilize Iceland for testing and field trips and science research. But without joining, we do not have access to the market and cooperation. We do not have access to funding, and there is a reluctance to set up anything permanent in Iceland. It just simply won't happen. And finally, science and research infrastructure. I mean, just down to equipment that just economically does not make any sense to set up here, but having the access to them is extremely important. So that's where I see us going. And with joining the new program, I have to mention space as part of Horizon. Obviously, we talked about Horizon this morning and how immensely important it is. And Horizon is something that many people in Iceland understand, but to understand the economics of it, I have to just repeat this. For every dollar, euro, or crown we put into it, we have, on average, received 20 back. We're a small country that no one is threatened by. We're a very good partner to work with. We have access to working with anyone, and we're quite used to the idea of working internationally. This is the scale of benefits that we're looking at. So I am very excited for next year. I've said this before, I know, but I do genuinely feel that we are at a time now where we will have answers, and we will have taken giant leaps at the end of next year in policy. The leaps we've been taking for the last 3 years is activity in the country, joint researches, space-derived company or pure space companies incorporating in Iceland, having a presence here, field trips, testing facilities. The activity, sort of what you would consider academic or upstream, that activity has multiplied in the few years since we started to kind of try to be a little bit more organized as a sector. And Earth observation and AI infusion. And just finally, I know I'm talking a lot, just as an example, we have a program called Summer Jobs in Space. It is an extraordinarily inexpensive program, so we emphasize that because it's so efficient. So anyone can go to Space Iceland if they're at the university and sort of check. Maybe they want to create a project for themselves. We'll help you get funding for it, and you'll work at our office on a project that you're interested in. So we've done, like I said, terminology in space. We've done reports on how to attract habitat testing and designing and so on. But this summer, we had a project where we thought, let's make an environmental air quality model for Reykjavik. Let's take data from Copernicus, open data. Let's take data from Google on traffic, and let's take environmental data that the city has collected. We'll feed it into a system, and it shows the air quality day by day. What we'll also do is teach AI to understand and predict. In a month, we had a functioning demo for a limited amount of time because the amount of data is just so that we decided to set a limited amount of time. Not to throw anyone under the bus, but there is a project that has been ongoing with the government now for 9 years, and they haven't been able to do it. Why? Because they haven't looked at space and the incredible efficiency that we have to offer. So that's where we stand. We need to understand the transcending effect that space has, an incredible effect of it, and we need to continue just moving ahead policy-wise, because this sector is going to be, it's always going to be driven by foreign investment, but we need authorities that are supportive and are willing to kind of take the next step. I've often described them, it was originally a joke, but I think there's truth to it, as when you were asked if they're supportive, aggressively absent. So not supportive, but absolutely not in our way. But it's maybe time to take the next step where you can be interested. And then we'll see in 5 years if you want to invest more. And that would be a huge step. But I do really believe that we are at the step now, and I've seen it happen, where we are no longer meeting people that are just kind of petrified that they will be responsible for space. We actually are speaking to people that are extremely enthusiastic about taking political, technical, and policy responsibility for it. So next year, we're going to have something good to tell you. So thank you, guys. And we're going to take a 5-minute break because we need to, well, maybe 10-minute break because we need to clear the stage and everything, and then